Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, December 8th. As Israel takes its war to Gaza ever deeper to the south, there are growing signs the Biden administration is looking for a way to end the fighting sooner rather than later. At the same time, the Israeli government seems more determined than ever to continue the fight until the very end. Here back in Washington, the Senate failed this week to vote on President Biden's proposal for major assistance to both Ukraine and Israel, with every single Republican senator voting against more aid. What does this deadlock mean for Ukraine? And finally, Google launched Gemini, a new chatbot that it wants to compete with OpenAI's ChatGPT-4. The EU is trying to get new regulation in place as quick as it can. But as the AI race heats up, is it getting too late to pass the kind of regulations and governance structure to figure out what to do with this technology? Here to talk about these issues are the reporters that cover these stories. Giles Whittell is the World Affairs editor at Tortoise Media. Ryan Heath covers technology, including AI, for Axios. Unfortunately, our third panelist had to do her day job. She is reporting about the UN Security Council discussion ongoing right now about Hamas. So just the three of us, but looking forward to having this discussion. Great to see both of you here on what in Chicago at least is a sunny morning. Giles, let's start with you. The war is now full force. Another week has gone by. It's way down in the south, which is where virtually all the people in Gaza are living. Fighting a real war in the midst of the most urban and densely populated part of a city is not easy. And it seems that the Biden administration is starting to join much of the rest of the world saying, you know, we really ought to start thinking about how this thing is going to end sooner rather than later. How do you see it?
As you were saying just before we started, what is happening in the South is what both the US and the UK and other foreign interlocutors said cannot happen after the pause. Let's just remember there was a week-long pause, after which most of the civilian population, more than 2 million people, were to be found in the south, the north, almost completely destroyed, not worth going back to. The messages, insofar as they mean anything to Israel, were, please do not do in the south what you've done in the north. We respect your right to self-defense, etc. But that is what is happening. I mean, just to bring everybody up to date, both sides, Israel and Hamas, said that over the past 24 hours, the fighting in southern Gaza has been more intense than at any point in the war. So, we have a noise outside of a great drinks trolley rolling past. Forgive me. 450 targets struck by the IDF, by their own count. That's roughly twice the pre-pause average. 350 Palestinians killed, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, so for a total of more than 17,000. I mean, these numbers are depressingly familiar. They just tick up and up. We had the executive director of Médecins Sans Frontières taught us last night for Médecins Sans Frontières UK, but she's a sort of veteran of getting aid in and out of Gaza. They have had 5 staff killed in Gaza since the war began. 2 of them apparently targeted in a convoy marked with all the MSF logos on the roofs and sides of the vehicles. So from their point of view, it's getting really very difficult to justify sending people in. Never mind stay on the sidelines of the debate. Ivo, you were saying it feels as if we're coming to a break point between the US and Israel, maybe the UK and Israel, for what it's worth. I think you're right. The question is it imminent in terms of days or is it weeks? The The difficulty is the overarching question, what is the Israeli strategy? And I suggest we can say three things very briefly about it. The first is that it's unclear. It's the fog of war. The second thing is that there are signs that Israel, to an extent, the IDF accepts that their their tactics have to evolve over time. There's an interesting piece in the New York Times about how the IDF are using the very latest in technology to bring intelligence back to troops on the ground in real time. And so in that detailed sense, granular sense, tactics are changing all the time and strategy may have to change with it. But it is probably also plausible to say that when and if negotiations return in earnest over the return of the 140 remaining hostages, Israel will want to be, or you can at least rationalize what's happening or try to, with the argument that Israel will want to be negotiating from a position of extreme strength or a boot on the neck of Hamas, however you want to describe it. But in the meantime, Hamas, if you regard it as an idea rather than organization, is probably getting stronger, not weaker. The very large number of civilian families who have now lost people, you can make the argument, will now be seeking a conduit through which to seek revenge in the future. So with that sense of helplessness, you've got the Biden administration quite clearly, I mean, most recently through Blinken, I think yesterday, or possibly this morning, saying, please take extreme care over civilian casualties. And as you intimated, let's remember there's no love lost long-term between Biden and Netanyahu. I remember clearly when I was in Washington more than 10 years ago now, one of the first Israel stories that I had to cover was of Vice President Biden in Jerusalem trying to make nice as a representative, the most senior representative of the new Obama administration, with an early Netanyahu administration, and while he was there, unannounced, a big new expansion of West Bank settlements that completely blindsided Biden's delegation, and they basically had to cancel the agenda and fly home. And I don't really think at the base level, relations between the two of them have got much better since.
Giles, that's a lot of things there that you put on the table, and Ryan, I mean, pick up any one of those pieces that you want. I think just to emphasize the degree of growing unhappiness in the Biden administration. You had Vice President Kamala Harris in Dubai with probably the clearest speech setting limits to what the Israelis should be doing when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, and this real hammering away at that the Gazans need to stay in Gaza and not be pushed into Egypt, which of course the Egyptians are also making very clear, signaling to some extent that they are worried that this is part of the plan, that the way to solve the humanitarian crisis is by having no more civilians in Gaza. And the Secretary of Defense last Saturday, a major speech that you can have tactical victories but strategic defeat. I think making Giles's point that Hamas in some ways is winning because it's gaining more adherents, not losing them around not only Gaza but the rest of the place. It's really looking like the difference between how this strategy needs to evolve that the U.S. is seeing and frankly rest of the world is seeing, and the Netanyahu government is becoming starker and starker, and it doesn't look like it matters much to how Israel is conducting the war.
I mean, there is a lot of tactics, is what I hear. I don't really see a strategy. I don't think there's been a strategy for a very long time, and that's why all of this has blown up in everybody's faces so severely over the past 6 weeks. So, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I think the U.S. administration, like you talk to people at the National Security Council, for example, and they feel very clear that they have made a positive difference to the situation, but no one's really happy about how it's going, but they think they've made some impact on Israel. You know, if there's to be a break between the US and Israel, I think all of that will come out in the wash of sort of if and when Netanyahu goes, which won't be in the heat of the fighting. It will be at some point in the short to medium term future, I think. I don't think he has a future. And I pin a lot of the problems to him. I'm not typically a believer in history about a few big men making the difference, but I think you can trace a lot of problems around the arc of Netanyahu in Israel. I wouldn't accuse Egypt of blackmail, but one of the solutions here is to move people into Egypt so Israel can do what it thinks it has to do in Khan Yunis or, wherever it thinks that's going to end. And I know that all sounds horrible and transactional, but, if they're going to do it anyway, isn't it better to have people away from the space? And then in the absolute 50,000 foot bigger picture is even beyond talking about two-state solutions. You don't solve any of this unless you give economic prospects to people who live in Gaza. And for that, you need infrastructure, you need skills, you need an education system, and none of that exists. And none of that was even provided for in whatever two-state solution planning did exist going back 30 years. So we just don't really have any of the pieces for any of the solutions at this point in time. And then slightly randomly, but one thing I also would note is the Palestinian Authority, which is itself a mess. He's in the 18th year of a 4-year term, Mahmoud Abbas. They've been quite cooperative with the Israeli government, and that doesn't get a lot of attention. But that is something else that's been going on in the background, because they're also no fans of Hamas. But we just prop them up because they're less worse than Hamas, and that's also not a solution. So sorry to throw you a lot of random negative facts or thoughts, but I don't see a lot of hope out there.
Well, let me put one positive on the table, Giles, and I think Ryan, you're right to have stressed that if you talk to people in the White House and the administration, they will make the case that without us, this would have been far, far, far worse. We've been able to exert influence. That the bear hug strategy of hugging the Israeli government closely was both something that Biden was going to do no matter what. But importantly, he used it as a means to try to exert influence. And one of those areas we've seen is on humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza. Remember, this started off with the siege that nothing was going to come in. Biden then traveled to Israel in the middle of October, and the border started to go open up. One of the reasons the administration pushed for a pause was not just to focus on the question of hostages, but also to get more aid in. And now a second crossing is opening up into Gaza in the corner of Israel, Gaza, and Egypt, to do inspections and to really start getting 100 plus, if not more, trucks coming in. Of course, not enough, not sufficient, completely, but it has fuel and everything else that is coming out there. So is there a way to mitigate at least the way that things are going in the world here, and in order to try to see what's going on?
Well, there are alternative military strategies that have been suggested. You have to caveat all this at the top with a reminder to everybody involved, including ourselves, that what is the phrase? The first contact with reality, all plans collapse. But you read about the alternative to all-out war in a heavily populated civilian zone, namely a campaign of targeted killings, and there is an historical precedent, or at least the US claims there is, and carried out under General McChrystal in Iraq. It's still pretty ugly. It's still block to block. You will still take casualties, but it doesn't involve saturation aerial bombardment, for example, with the collateral damage that comes with that. You mention the sort of residual American satisfaction or hope that that the administration's influence has already had a bearing on Israel's strategy, and I'm sure that's true. There's also the question, and this is a question, I don't know the answer to it. Were there to be a clean break on the conduct of this war between Israel and Washington, let's forget the UK and, frankly, Europe as bit players in this. Can Israel continue in what would be more or less complete isolation, given that its traditional allies in the region, Jordan and Egypt, are very constrained now in the extent to which they can offer help? I mean, it seems to me, genuine question, that although there's no love lost between them personally, Biden is in a position to play hardball here. The only risk being that sheer rage on the part of Netanyahu and his government, which is in a large degree justified. Let's not forget the atrocities of October the 7th, would lead Netanyahu's government into a strategy of what we would call in England cutting off its nose to spite its face. In other words, a doomed strategy.
Ryan,
I mean, I think that's true to some extent, Giles, but to create a bit of a bridge to the next topic, I think what we will also start to see is a lot of political footballing between Russia, Ukraine, and Israel. So even if that is in Biden's political interest and it becomes the administration's moral viewpoint, Republicans are starting to shift their interest and their favors from Ukraine to Israel. And we started to see that in some of those extraordinary hearings around those university presidents not being willing to call out genocide as harassment. And we can go into that if people aren't familiar with that, and the blocking of Ukraine aid. So you might start to see Republican Congress just going all the more in for Israel as Biden seeks to pull back or put constraints in. And then there might be some kind of trade that is forced in the funding of the two wars.
Yeah, we'll jump into that in 1 second. I think I would make one other point, that it isn't clear to me that for quite a while Israel needs the American assistance that it is getting. Yes, there are weapons still flowing into it, and yes, 10% of the Israeli defense budget is funded by the sort of the big strategic deal that the Obama administration concluded back in 2016 for 30 plus billion of funding over 10 years. But the actual conduct of this war on the ground is largely being fought with weapons that are indigenous and produced in Israel. There's some exceptions with regard to the Iron Dome and the air defense systems, but as we're seeing, the level of rocket attacking coming from Gaza is quite limited compared to what it was, in part because the Gazans, the Hamas doesn't have a clear possibility to getting any weapons off because of the Israeli domination there. So I'm actually thinking, and you read in various Israeli press accounts that Netanyahu was preparing for the day where Biden has to break with him. And in fact, perhaps not even, although he preferred U.S. support, making Biden the enemy may work for him politically in a way that, of course, he has long done, having embraced Republicans including Donald Trump. He ran his the one before, election campaign with Trump on every poster. So it's not clear to me that the U.S. has that kind of leverage, and I think the administration's argument is this leverage is by being supportive. Rather than by walking away and cutting it off. And then I think Ryan's point on clearly the Republicans have decided that support for Israel, no matter what, is a good thing, and they're pushing now for Israel alone bill on aid. So I think that's kind of where we are, which is a good bridge, as Ryan says, to Ukraine and let me paint the background here a little bit. For what has happened. Of course, this week, the Senate tried to force a vote on President Biden's package of $106 billion, which is about 60 plus billion for Ukraine, including economic and humanitarian assistance, and then 14 some billion for Israel, support for Taiwan, support for border security at about 20 billion, as well as aid for Gaza, a very big package that the president put on the table about a month ago, and the Senate put it on the floor. Senator Schumer put it on the floor, in order to, as a test vote, to see if you could get 60 votes, which is what in our democracy the Senate now needs to do. It's not 50 plus 1; it's 60% of the people present needing to vote for this, and the Republicans all voted against it. And there's a real question now about Ukraine aid coming out of the United States, and as a result for other places as well, because next week the European Union is meeting in a big council to make two very big decisions on Ukraine. One, whether to start accession talks with the European Union, and second, a big aid package from the European Union itself, 50 billion euros meant to be in both grants and loans, direct budgetary support to the Ukrainian government so it can pay salaries and keep the lights back on to the extent that the Russians aren't constantly bombing the power stations. And that one is in trouble too, because of Hungarian opposition, and also some significant financial issues in Germany. And so, I've been an optimist on Ukrainian aid. I remain optimistic on Ukrainian aid. I think the world is united, at least the Western world, united in the need to support Ukraine. But you start wondering when domestic politics starts interfering in this, as it does in anything, whether we're at a tipping point. Ryan, let me sort of start with you. You mentioned you were in Washington and heard the new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron of the UK, making a strong case for aid as the vote was being held and going down, or day after, I guess it was. And so, how do you see the situation evolving?
Yeah, I mean, some of the arguments Cameron was making remain the oldest and the best arguments, which is that if we do not stop Russia in Ukraine, who's next, given their track record? So, that's the same messaging will keep occurring there. But new messaging, which I don't think is something that people fully understood in how the US money is being spent to support Ukraine, is that the vast majority of it is actually spent inside the US, making munitions and other weapons, and that typically occurs more in red states than in blue states. So for the sort of people that in the Trump base or in Congress who do not feel comfortable with this sort of funding, David Cameron and others are trying to make the argument that actually it's in their direct political interest to keep this going because it is a form of economic nationalism as well as the right way to support democracy around the world. But what we saw today, in the immediate aftermath of the failure to get that funding, is Moscow sending long-range missiles into Kiev for the first time in months, and Putin thanking the Republicans. So, I mean, I'm kind of at a loss for words. Like it's logical that all these things would occur, but amazing that people would allow this to happen after all of the post-war effort that went into building up NATO and democratic infrastructure around the world. Like it's kind of stunning the way things can crumble.
Well, and as Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell have said, both of whom unfortunately voted against the aid, but have said many times, the amount of money the U.S. has spent in supporting Ukraine is a fraction of what it would have to be spent in order to do what Ukraine has done, which is
this was Cameron's best line, Ivo. He said for 10% of the U.S. defense budget to go to Ukraine to destroy 50% of Russia's pre-war military. He was like, that's an astounding investment. Like that's the sort of investment that people who got into Bitcoin early would have been happy with. So it's stunning that Republicans of all people aren't happy with that investment.
Well, they are, but they're just not willing to vote for more. That's because of internal politics that within their own party, and that is, I think, unfortunately where we are. But we're seeing similar pressures in Europe, Giles, where the European Union, which knows it is a little closer to Ukraine and has to be part of any solution, can't just blame the Senate or the House for inaction if it can't get its own house in order.
No, it'll be blaming Viktor Orban of Hungary instead. He is the man who will be in the spotlight at the summit that you mentioned next week. I mean, everyone's familiar with this now, perhaps not, but as a sideshow, it's a very important one. Orban has an effective veto over this 50 billion euro package, which the package itself is extremely important and significant, bigger than the EU has assembled in some time, and in some sense, a conscious preparation for a future in which possibly there is a Trump 2 presidency and a sudden cessation of American military aid. And Olaf Scholz, the German leader, among others, are slowly beginning to realize that it will then be the European NATO members or nobody who backstops Ukraine on this. But in a nutshell, Orban has had about 20 billion euros of European money withheld because of his attack on the rule of law in Hungary. And people are reasonably clear that all he's doing now is naming his price, and that some financial deal will end his veto on the approving the military package for and budgetary package for Ukraine. But it remains to be seen. There's going to be brinkmanship down to the wire next week, and it's Orban and Hungary who have the whip hand. I would just say, in relation to the American side of this, we've been talking to some of the Ukrainian MPs who've been traveling backwards and forwards to DC and been involved, perhaps only on the sidelines, in those negotiations. And rightly or wrongly, they share your optimism, Ivo, that ultimately that deal will get done. I was talking to our Ukraine reporter, who in turn had been in touch with them, and they're saying, well, all that needs to happen is the Democrats need to unbend on the border, on the Mexican border issue. I don't know how is that going to happen, because in principle that is true, isn't it? If Biden agrees to the Republican budgetary requests for the border, then the deal's done and the Ukrainian money goes through, or is it not that simple?
I mean, it is that simple. The question is, what border measures are we talking about? And so, the Biden administration, remember, at the urging of Mitch McConnell, who was the one who first put together this large package of materials, put in $20 billion of emergency aid for border security, which, by the way, is very much needed. There's a lot happening on the border. And the Republicans are saying, well, that's great, but what we really want you to do is, quote, shut the border. And shutting the border is one, anybody who's seen the border, it's pretty long, it's pretty difficult to do. But second, there's such thing as law and the rule of law and how you deal with that, including international obligations that the United States, like every other country, has when it comes to questions of asylum and others. And so this is very complicated. Immigration policy is very complicated. The last time the U.S. had a very serious immigration reform bill was 1986, if I'm right, when Ronald Reagan was president. And I can tell you, most people in Congress were not even thinking of running for Congress. It's a different era. And then the question is this the way you reform immigration as part of an emergency spending bill for Ukraine and other places? So yes, in theory, you could get a deal. Although even if you get that deal, it's not clear that everybody would support it, and including in the House. So it's just more complicated than, if Biden cracks, things will be fine. Yes, if he cracks, things could happen, but how certain can you be of it? And given the lack of trust that now exists on Capitol Hill among members of, including in their own parties, let alone across the aisle or across Pennsylvania Avenue, it's hard to see. Brian, how do you read it?
I agree with you that it's hard to see, but this is where I think Democrats are too cute and they get caught up in themselves. Like, that's the deal to be struck. It's not going to create long-term immigration reform, but there aren't enough resources at the border to uphold international obligations in the first place, whether you're trying to crack down and secure the border or whether you're trying to support people from a humanitarian perspective. And if that's the way to solve the Ukraine issue, it's still a pretty decent deal. And so I think Democrats should ask themselves questions like, what would Bill Clinton do? And I think Bill Clinton would strike this deal. And so I'm not saying it wouldn't hurt a bunch of people, but I don't see the group of Democrats that would not vote for Biden next year because some funding went to the border. But I can see a bunch of problems for Democrats if the border continues to be a growing, unmanageable political problem and a thing that Republicans can refer to as something that Democrats have neglected. And then if you add on top of that, total disaster in Ukraine, well, how's Biden going to get reelected then? So I do think there's a deal to be done. And I also think Democrats aren't going to take that opportunity.
They're not going to take the opportunity not to do the deal.
They're going to prefer
the deal, right?
On their moral high ground,
separating
all the issues out and not striking the compromise, as messy as it might be.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Giles?
I just wanted to pick up on Cameron, because it's fascinating for me, having seen him as an effective prime minister and then as a rather embarrassed ex-prime minister, getting himself to all kinds of post-prime ministerial trouble, trying to make some money, basically. Yeah. It's fascinating to hear.
Including on China.
Including on China.
In glory.
But to hear you describing him obviously performing well at what he does best. If you're uncharitable, you'll say what he does best is PR. But did he clearly made that argument about red state, investment in red state is what this military aid might actually be. But what about the big picture, which is that if Ukraine doesn't get this aid, either from the US or from the EU, preferably both, the whole war could swing back and Ukraine could lose, whether that means it cedes 20% of its territory permanently, or an offense turns into defense, turns into retreat, and it loses half the country east of the Dnipro River. Did he speak in those terms as well, geopolitical terms?
Yeah, and he actually had a brilliant line on that, which was to say that we all made mistakes going back to 2008 with the Georgia invasion, that he deeply regretted not taking a stronger stand in 2014. And then he brought it back to referendums and made the self-deprecating joke that he knows a lot about referendums and how they can be misused and how they can go wrong. And that was his Brexit sort of falling on his sword. But his point was to say that Ukrainians in every single district voted for an independent Ukraine separate from Russia in 1991. And we would not accept the arguments of any other country that suddenly just falls apart by force in the space of 30 years. And so we should not fall for this idea that Crimea is Russia's, because it is not in any legal sense and not in any democratic sense Russian, even though he essentially eventually agreed it's up for the Ukrainian government to ultimately negotiate if they want to. It's not for us to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine, but he was like, we should never fall for this Russian propaganda that Crimea is Russian.
I mean, I'll make a final point on this, which I think is also important. You sometimes hear that the war is now stalemated. The Ukrainian chief of general staff has said as much in his Economist article. Zelensky this week has admitted that has conceded that the offensive didn't go as well as they had hoped, and in fact has said that they need to move to a defensive strategy. And there's now overwhelming agreement among military analysts that for now the focus needs to be on Ukraine strengthening its defenses rather than try to continue a counteroffensive that's not working. Perhaps strike deeper into Crimea and make it increasingly impossible for the Russians to use Crimea as both a naval and a staging base. However, the success of that holding strategy is crucially dependent on continued provision of military aid to Ukraine. I mean, without that, the Russians, who are increasing both their equipment from the North Koreans and a revitalized defense industry, largely supported by the Chinese, plus the fact that they just have more manpower and don't seem to care how many die in the fighting, will continue to fight. And so this idea, it's a stalemate. Let's not put, as you hear sometimes, throw good money after bad. misunderstands that, in fact, to maintain the stalemate, it is important for Ukraine to be armed and continue to have this kind of equipment, because the alternative is not just losing that territory; it's perhaps even losing the war in the real sense of Moscow determining who rules and gets to say the future of Ukraine, which is what this war is about. Not about the Donbass. It's about who gets to decide the future of Ukraine. So that's an unsatisfactory argument, but then politically, but it is the truth. Even to maintain the status quo, you need to continue to do what we have been doing for the last 18 months. Anyway, let's take these are the easy issues: Hamas, Gaza, Ukraine, U.S. funding. Let's take the tough issue, Ryan. A lot happening in AI, heating up in terms of the technology, just evolving at an incredible speed. And there is this growing question. You have to debate in an open AI over the question of is safety versus commercialization the issue, and governments trying to catch up with the reality that technology is evolving at a clip that few understand, and even fewer can figure out how you regulate in a way that you get the benefit of all that's good. And we saw some of that at COP28 with new AI advances in terms of dealing with climate change, but not are able to stop all that's bad. Help us understand where we are.
There's a couple of big mega trends going on. And so the very first thing I would say is that we remain at the very early days of AI. I don't think anyone knows where this is going to go, not even in the medium term. But what we are certainly doing is going back into this era where Silicon Valley moves fast and breaks things. That is the message out of Sam Altman retaining control of OpenAI. They are moving towards a fully for-profit structure. The people that want to keep innovating without knowing what the consequences are have been winning those internal battles. That was how they got the jump on Google in the first place, who had been the big leaders in this generative AI field. And so Google themselves came out this week with this new Gemini AI product. And that's indicative of the second trend I wanted to mention, which is that we all got sort of a punch in our stomach when we saw how real and human the ChatGPT chatbot felt. Well, text chatbots aren't the endpoint of AI. That's really clear. And what Gemini is a much more multimodal version of AI, where you can do a lot of other visual and video-based things, and that's going to start to resemble a lot more where we're going with AI over the longer term. And then the question of how you regulate all of that is really difficult. We literally have a situation where Meta, as in Facebook's parent company, have now decided to frame themselves as the true safety advocates in the AI world. And there's some merit to what they're saying and the effort that they're making there. But you talk to Meta executives and they'll literally be like, yeah, well, we don't really know how to evaluate these things yet. So that's why we're sharing all of this information, but we're just putting it all out there anyway. So they don't know how to make it safe, but that is not stopping anyone from releasing this stuff out into the wild, including into the hands of the North Korean and the Iranian regimes and so on. So it is a big set of unknowns. And when you have so many unknowns, it's really hard to try and regulate that. And the EU has put 2 years of work into trying to build up a regulation, and possibly in the next 12 hours, or at least the next 72 hours, they're going to finalize their new EU AI Act. And that will be a big advance, much like the EU made the big step forward on privacy regulation a few years ago. But they didn't anticipate generative AI in their initial footwork. So they were caught off guard this year and had to re-engineer the whole thing around what ChatGPT showed us. And there are big divisions over what sort of exceptions you make in this regulation for national security, defense, intelligence agency, police provisions, and so on. And that's the big dividing line there is governments want those exceptions and want flexibility, and the European institutions want to be the ones with bringing the hard line down. And then the trick is, okay, you can be as hard as you want, but if you can't anticipate what's happening next, what have you actually regulated? How do you pivot when that new thing comes and sideswipes you. So it is, one step forward, 3 steps sideways is how I would characterize the whole landscape at the moment.
Well, and AI is probably smart enough to figure out every loophole and every AI regulation there exists. So
yeah.
It is, it's not you throw your hands up in the air. It's but it's a real issue. And Giles, I know the British government has tried to sort of take a leadership role on this with, or at least try to say this is something we all ought to be thinking and talking about. And had this big meeting a couple of weeks ago at Bletchley Park to have this discussion. And I mean, just one sort of interesting thing. The question was, okay, in which room are we allowing the Chinese, and in which room are we not allowing the Chinese when it comes to try to talk about this? Just to even underscore the difficulty there, that technology, of course, intersects with national security and economic security as well. Just emphasizing the difficulty. So, how do you see it? What do you hear from your friends in London?
Well, I think in the end, the Brits were pleased that the Chinese showed up at all at Bletchley Park, because it was quite a bold play. Can we be a regulatory force in this industry without having much skin in the game? And until recently, Europe itself was playing the same game. But as I understand it, 2 things happened, as you suggest, Ryan. They were overtaken by events, namely ChatGPT, but they also saw the beginnings, some green shoots of a European generative AI industry, one in France, which I think is called Mistral. I forget the name of the one in Germany. We have no equivalent in the UK. And they thought, well, if we overregulate now, then we will nip it in the bud and we won't have anything to compete with the giants in the US. The UK position reminds me of nothing more than autonomous driving, where when Johnson was still Prime Minister, they recognized that we had no real technological players there, so we'd try to be a regulatory player instead. That didn't go anywhere. I mean, as far as I can see, the lesson of the discussions that have been held in the UK and the EU is that if you try to regulate advances in AI ex post facto, which is a pompous way of saying how we're doing it now, as opposed to using the farmer model of saying, bring us everything, we will test it, and we will let it out into the market only after we've decided it's safe. Unless you do that, you're always going to be outrun by technology. That's the limit of my understanding of AI, but it's going fast, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the real critical win for people who believe we need to be conscious about negative consequences is allowing some form of third-party auditing of how these models occur, and to not be absolutist about whether a system is a so-called closed system or an open source system, because that's a long-running debate in the tech field that is almost deeply ideological, or very partisan cant one way or the other. And the EU, for example, is on the verge of making exceptions, saying, well, if it's open source, you don't have to do all of this testing. And I'm like, that's not true either. The thing is, what you need is people who are not the makers of a product to be able to verify what the worst consequences of the product might be. And it's probably tricky if that is a fully governmental body, but it does need to be people who are technical experts. So somehow it's got to be sort of quasi-governmental, but also independent of the companies, probably. And that's a really tricky plane to land, because the companies obviously don't want that scrutiny, even if they say they care about safety. And people inside a set of bureaucratic institutions probably don't have the capability to do it all on their own and might not be trusted to do it. So, the trick is finding some way to keep these companies accountable, but that isn't based on existing models of regulation or exactly how we test, children's toys or cigarettes or something like that.
I think the one idea that I've heard that is in some sense interesting is the IPCC model. So to take the climate change model, where scientists from around the world evaluate the knowledge base, and you could do evaluation of the technology base, and provide guidance, at least, because part of the problem is that, as you say, Ryan, governments don't really have the expertise to do this. Companies don't even necessarily know what it is that is produced by the products that they have, but getting some kind of handle. And now I note that the people who are pushing those are the very people who are also pushing the technology, from Eric Schmidt at Google to Mustafa Suleiman at Anthropic and others. But that said, we do need to find a way to get the expertise and do it at an international level to oversee what's going on. Because, Giles, you're right, there may not be any green shoots of AI in Britain. However, the first big breakthrough in AI came by a British company, and DeepMind that Google then bought, and that the two people who are leading that effort, including the person now leading that effort in Google, of course, came from the UK. So we live in it within science. We live in this strange international world, and it probably needs some international governance structure to deal with all of that. Fascinating discussion. It's always good to bring different perspectives, and Giles Whittell, Tortoise Media, and Ryan Heath of Axios. Thanks for an excellent discussion today. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review, and until then, have all a great weekend. Thank you.